Hi, welcome to this discussion as part of our Think 2025 dialogue with various stakeholders on issues such as climate change and energy. We are very, very privileged to have with us Mr. Neil Buhne today, who's the UN resident coordinator for Pakistan. And as part of his job, he's supposed to coordinate across all of the different agencies the UN has in Pakistan to look after the development work that's going on as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Neil has been here for a very long time, 5 years, and has served in 8 other countries before coming to Pakistan. But sadly, Neil is going to be leaving this job and going to Bangkok to provide an overarching role in the Far East. So Neil, first of all, thank you very much for taking time out and for joining us as part of this dialogue.
And thanks for including me, and it's a great name, Think 2025. I hope I'm still thinking clearly in 2020.
Thank you. So this is thing about 2025 now, right? So imagining a future where we would be well on the way to solving the climate crisis and would be energy abundant across all our domains and across all our segments. And as you would know from your experience in Pakistan, that we are an energy deficit country. A large part of the population doesn't have access to energy. What we think about is we cannot develop them in the same way that the rest of the population has developed, with the binge on fossil fuel, with the climate crisis that's looming. So that's why we believe we need to start thinking now in terms of what are those sustainable development pathways that will solve both the climate crisis and the energy crisis. And that's why it's very important to hear from your perspective the UN's view. So, Neil, I just want to start with your broader work in Pakistan, the last 4 or 5 years, and your role as a resident coordinator. Maybe just if you can just touch upon the key activities, developmental activities that UN is supporting. What's the mandate? Maybe just talk about some of the key areas.
Yeah, well, my role is to really lead the United Nations work in Pakistan, trying to help get the best out of the 19 agencies we have here, trying to get the best out of the more than 3,000 staff we have here, the bulk of them Pakistani, 300 of them coming from other countries, with our biggest base outside Islamabad in Peshawar, after that in Quetta, and after that in Karachi and then Lahore, with work also being done in Muzaffarabad and in Gilgit and other parts of the country. And what do we do? Well, we try to support Pakistanis in improving their lives, basically, but there's many different aspects to it. I mean, one is we still have humanitarian programs in Pakistan. Pakistan, unfortunately, has gone through a pretty difficult time, some of them related to environment and energy, the floods 2011 and 2010 being very recent, but also the work that's consumed me more has been the effects of people being displaced from strife, primarily in the northwest of the country, and helping those people return. So that's one aspect. I mean, we have work, for example, at the moment on nutrition. That's a big issue in the country, with 40 to 45% of children under 5 stunted, which means they're not only not as big as they should be, but it means that everything's not the way it should be, including their cognitive abilities. Their brain doesn't develop as it should, and that's a tremendous drag and injustice in the country. We work on one of the better known programs is the polio program, which is a global public good, and which we have funds from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But again, the government is leading that primarily. And there we work all over the country. It made a lot of progress. It's had some difficulty this year, which I think reflects the difficulty and sort of somewhat ridiculous mistrust that there is, absurd distrust, that's the word I was looking for, of vaccines. However, we also work on climate change and on energy provision. And there's also an absurd distrust around the world about climate change. It's like there's some parallels between people rejecting science on vaccines and people rejecting science on climate change. So on energy, I mean, we have work on energy conservation. We have work on renewables. We have a lot of work on trying to also reduce the effect of greenhouse gases on development in Pakistan. And We have a lot of work that we do actually with government and private sector as well across the board. I mean, I could go on for a long, long time. We spend about $500 million a year in Pakistan. That's not as much as, say, the IMF or the World Bank, but it's focused more on specific projects that build capacity and do policy. So we like to think that we get more bang for the rupee.
Fantastic. I think it's a very broad brush, I guess, on what UN is doing locally. The few areas where we are, I think we're going to talk about today, but I think issues such as stunted growth, malnutrition, I think these are high on government agenda, so I think that's just in line with the policy of the new government. I believe, are you finding good partners in the new establishment, new government in Pakistan?
Yeah, I think all the political parties support the Sustainable Development Goals. The Pakistan Parliament was the first or among the very first in the world to approve the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2015. So there is a consensus on the broad issues. I think what's good about the current government is they're quite willing to talk about issues which otherwise government might have had on their priorities, but they weren't talked about as openly or they weren't prioritized. And one example is nutrition. One example is, of course, issues of corruption and governance. One example is the population growth rate. But another example is also the environmental issues facing the country, because Pakistan is extremely vulnerable in many, many ways. Partly it's vulnerable because it has such a large portion of its population which is poor, maybe not poor in terms of income, that's improved, but poor in terms of access to health services, poor in terms of access to education, poor in terms of their ability to engage in society, all those things. And it's also highly vulnerable to climate change because of the nature of the economy of the country, that so much is agriculture based. That agriculture depends upon water coming down from glaciers and mountains in the high Himalayas and Karakoram, glaciers that are melting, mountains which are subject to all sorts of different periods than before. You've also got a big effect from increasing amounts of rainfall, which make people more vulnerable to flooding. The fact that you have so many more people living in urban areas, living in urban slums with inadequate energy supply, but also architecture that's not designed like Mohenjo-daro was 3,500 years ago, with wind tunnels and things to keep it naturally cool. Architecture which is made of cement block, which heats up and means when it gets to 40, 45 degrees, you have people dying from heat. And Pakistan has to make a huge number of adjustments, has to reduce its vulnerability. Otherwise, the sort of natural resilience that Pakistanis have to so many shocks, that resilience won't be enough.
Fantastic. I think fantastic reference to Mohenjo-daro. And I think what it paints in clear, vivid form is the fact that we have unlearned as a civilization all those techniques of sustainable development. The wind tunnels you're talking about, they were lost, and we are well behind in terms of those practices in what we do. I think climate change, I think, is one of the burning issues right now. I think biggest threat to mankind, I guess. And one of our previous speakers was talking about poverty and climate change as two main issues for us, and how they are interrelated. And I think you've touched upon the slum areas and how in the rural areas climate change is impacting people. This is one topic that we see a lot of public discourse, generates a high emotional response amongst all the stakeholders. But the world at large has been slow in action. More so locally in Pakistan, you see a lot of inaction, being one of the worst affected countries, or projected to be one of the worst affected countries in terms of water crisis and other issues related to climate change. Why do you think there's this disconnect between what we're talking about, what we believe is the biggest issue, and action on this front?
Well, I think partly it's the hypocrisy of countries from the part of the world I come from, in the north, because they have produced the largest number of greenhouse gases. There has been talk in the past, and many people are very sincere, many governments are sincere about climate change, but the fact is that not enough is being done to reduce the carbon footprint of places that have footprints that are the size of snowshoes. And I think, and so countries like Pakistan say, well, they're not doing much, why should we do much? And if you have leaders of particular countries who even deny climate change, they say, well, that's their problem, it's not our problem. I think another reason in Pakistan is that people have so many daily problems facing them. Climate change is still something like a giant rock on a cliff above you that it's hanging there, but as long as it's hanging there, you don't worry too much about it. When in fact, eventually it falls down and can fall down at any moment. And I think that's the issue here, is people have to realize that it can fall down at any moment and it can crush them. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Pakistan is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It's highly vulnerable to the problems of inadequate energy mix. Because of the nature of its climate, because it's dependent on irrigation, because the number of people who also live off of rainfed. I mean, Pakistan, I don't know if it's the largest or second or third largest number of livestock in the world. And the livestock, many of them are free range depending on rainfed. If that rain is not there or the rain is variable, they die. That affects the economy. There's so many ways. Pakistan is highly vulnerable in terms of oil prices. I think 80% of the energy mix here comes from oil. I think 4 or 5% comes from LNG. That is all imported. Now, if you have crises in the world, if you have energy crises, if you have climate change that causes political crisis, that will increase the price of oil or even affect the supply of it. And that means Pakistan is highly vulnerable, not just in terms of irrigation water, not just in terms of the rain, not just in terms of the heat, but also in terms of its energy mix, because so much of it is outside. And it doesn't need to be, because Pakistan has the capacity to generate energy within. It's done fairly well in terms of hydro, but there's a limit to what you can do with hydro, because there's only so many mountains that you can dam. And even then, in some cases, even if you do that, that can have other negative effects. Pakistan traditionally has done a lot in terms of biomass. And even when I worked here in the early 90s, I've actually lived in Pakistan 8.5 years.
Wow,
4 years this time. I lived 4.5 years in the early 90s. And at that time, we actually worked with the World Bank, the UN and the World Bank together, on mapping biomass throughout the country. And it was apparent, how much of ordinary people get their energy from biomass, but in a very inefficient, very informal way. And I think that's still true. If you could improve the efficiency of biomass generation, you could meet a lot of the demand in the country. And that's a fairly traditional form of energy. But then if you could also start to harness the wind. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in Sindh, and the wind's blowing off the sea on the Makran coast. I mean, if you could harness that and up in the mountains. And of course, solar. I mean, I think from wind there's, I don't have my statistic right in my head, but it's multiple 50 gigawatts, and
yeah.
Solar is...
Just in one corridor, yeah.
Solar is huge as well.
Yeah.
So Pakistan needs to become more self-sufficient in energy. I mean, international trade is great,
yeah,
but you should not trade in things that make you very vulnerable to climate change.
I think well said, well said. I think one point you raised was really, this lack of evidence-based policy making and a lot of rhetoric coming from up north, as you call it, from some of the key leaders globally. And I think it's this disconnect between what the scientific, overwhelming scientific evidence is telling us and then the policies we're coming up with. There's that disconnect. Now I was, about to interject, hypocrisy is not something you can lay a Western label on, right? We all have the right to be hypocrites to a certain extent.
Hypocrisy is a universal characteristic.
Universal characteristic. That's the term I was looking for. And you see that a lot in Pakistan. I think the fact that the economic argument has moved firmly in favor of all these renewable resources you spoke about, and yet we continue to invest a lot in fossil fuels, which in turn has an economic impact. And I think you very well pointed out the trade deficit and the, this dependency on imported fuel. But I guess this connection between the social issues we face and climate change, that's at least in public eye, it's not very well established. So do you want to touch upon how climate change or tackling climate change could help us deal with issues such as spread of disease, migration, extreme poverty, extreme weather? So how are these two sort of related?
Well, I can give an example right now. if Pakistan doesn't adapt to climate change. If you look at the situation, particularly in Sindh and Baluchistan over the last year, I mean, you have very, very many very poor people there. But because there was a drought, because there's droughts, there's always been droughts there, but the droughts now almost have become the norm. And so you have people who are living on the edge, and those people have some sort of coping capacity, but it gets ground down over the years. And then you have a slightly worse drought, and then that coping capacity completely disappears and they fall off the edge. And that's why, for the first time in a long time, we've actually been providing modest assistance, supplementing what the government does, but still providing international assistance to people affected by drought in many districts of Sindh and many districts of Baluchistan. Linked to that in a way is even things that you wouldn't think. For example, there's been an outbreak of HIV/AIDS in Sindh. It's happened in other places in Punjab as well on a smaller scale. And it's primarily because of the health system breaking down. But why is the health system breaking down? Well, partly that's larger policy issues, but you have a lot of demand for health. Poor people don't have much money. The government doesn't meet the services they need. They're not able to afford proper doctors. Their children get diarrheal diseases because there's no water. The water is bad in Sindh, the water is bad in Baluchistan, partly because of climate change, partly because of other issues. So they have to take their kids to the doctor all the time. They can't afford a proper doctor, so loving parents, but they go to the quack who offers a discount service with satisfaction, gives injections to their sick kids that don't actually help that much. Give lots of injections, you get a bit of HIV on that needle, and then suddenly you have a few hundred kids, like kids under less than 2 months of age actually, HIV positive. We had a WHO team, it's almost never seen that you get children that young with HIV, but it's in some way related to climate change because it's increased the vulnerability of the people. Water supply is worse, water supply doesn't increase, people are sick more, and they take risks, and those risks end up causing them health issues. Not to talk about, other diseases that are more common, heat exhaustion, malaria that spreads because you have rain that you don't expect in different places. You can go down the list.
Yeah, sure. I think it's very well rounded off in terms of the impact of climate change on people's lives. And I guess one of the phenomena that we witness is, as you put it, these are poor people with little income, and they have to spend it on things such as education, healthcare,
and energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, since our domain is focused on energy, I think we're talking a lot about renewable energy, being a renewable energy organization. I would like to bring your attention to SDG 7. Which is access to clean, affordable, modern energy to 100% of the population. And I think being one of the signatories and one of the countries that is part of that whole program, we need to provide that by 2030 to all of our population. And we know that 30% of the population doesn't have access to it. What are the climate-ready, sustainable pathways you think that are available to us to address that sustainable development goal?
I think Pakistan has made progress in terms of energy provision. There's been a lot more capacity that's been brought in. You don't have quite as many load shedding around the country as you had before, but there's still a lot. But I think the issue is it's not really clean and sustainable, the provision. And what needs to be done? One is, and I worked on this in the early 90s as well, one is issues of energy efficiency. There's so much energy wasted. Transmission lines are badly built. Transformers are old. Issues of, because the pricing is not right, not sensible, underpriced for people who can afford it, all sorts of wastage of energy. Stupid house designs, which means that you have to turn on the air conditioning for 6 months a year rather than maybe 2 months a year, if you have the luxury of air conditioning. All those things mean that Pakistan is highly energy inefficient. And I'm not even talking about the transport sector, for example, where you have all these cars that are out of tune, You have trucks that are out of tune, and you have very little use of rail actually in Pakistan to transport freight, let alone to transport people. It hasn't been invested in, even though it's amongst the most energy efficient of the ways of providing transport. And then another way is you need to make energy available, if you're going to 100%, in remote locations. And solar, and to a certain extent wind, is the perfect solution for having energy provision in remote locations. I just spent a lot of time, well, 4 days, fair amount for me, up in Hunza and Nagar and Gilgit a couple of weeks ago. It was a real luxury to be there. I had some professional reasons to be there, but it was so beautiful. But these communities, some of them are very remote, and some of them have microhydels, but solar is a very good solution in a place that is so sunny. But then you've also got to find ways to bring in other sorts of energy that are sustainable, such as solar and wind on a large scale. Wind can, as we've said already, multiple gigawatts can be generated from wind if it was properly harnessed. Even my home place in Canada, which is quite flat, it looks a bit like the Netherlands, it's not your image of Canada and the mountains, we have wind turbines everywhere. Wind turbines down the street from where my parents live.
And this is a country rich in fossil fuels.
Rich in fossil fuels, but we have wind turbines all over the place. And it's a change. It wasn't there 10 years ago. So Canada has adapted in the sense of developing renewables. I don't think I've seen a wind turbine in Pakistan. I know they exist, but I don't think I've seen one, even though there's lots of places. So those are the sort of changes. Energy efficiency, more sensible building, more sensible use of energy in industry and transport, and renewables, whether it be solar, whether it be wind, and also the use of biomass, as I talked about before.
Yeah. So, Neil, I think those are all sort of great technologies. I think they're helping with the economic argument on renewable energy. I think this is when the economics start changing and China starts scaling, countries like India, US started scaling solar and wind technology, prices started plummeting, the economic argument became stronger, and then that's when you saw large-scale adoption. That really hasn't happened in Pakistan. I mean, if you see the situation in the country, I think last 6-7 years, there was a complete sort of stalemate, confusion at the top level. Regulation wasn't very clear. There wasn't a lot of wind and solar power set up. We did about 1 gigawatt across the wind corridor, and then some solar. But if you compare that to other countries in the region, it's been quite abysmal. I mean, we haven't done it. Why do you think that that's the case? I mean, why do we continue to stutter on this front when countries like India and China are, on this binge towards renewable energy? And what role do you think UN can play in terms of moving us towards the sustainable path in terms of energy generation?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is political, in the sense that governments wanted to respond to load shedding, short-term pressure, and the easiest way to respond is to get a plant built up fairly quickly, often with private sector partnership. I think part of it is that also international partners haven't really emphasized that so much. But I think it's also that so many other problems in Pakistan that there's a tendency to focus on the short term. And I think that's one of the hopeful things with the new government, that they are looking a bit more beyond the short term. Because without looking beyond that short term, you're not going to make those investments, even though those investments they may not get rid of load shedding as quickly within 6 months as getting a gas turbine plant working. But they will provide solutions 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, and somehow the signals aren't strong enough for the long-term benefits. There's such an emphasis on the short term. And then sometimes, there's what's the economic term? Economic rents and things that come, market inconsistencies that give perverse incentives to decision makers to develop the wrong type of energy rather than the right sort of energy.
Fair point, fair point. I think, Neil, I think we've covered a very broad area. The phenomenon you see in Pakistan is that even though there's been stalemate on the policy level, regulation hasn't moved very fast. There hasn't been a lot of renewable integrated with the grid, but there's been this element of democratization of energy, where a lot of distributed energy has creeped in. People have found solutions. You must have seen in villages, people have put solar on rooftop. A lot of houses are putting up solar with net metering. A lot of that is happening. And I think private sector is playing a big role. Small suppliers, large suppliers, and they continue to push on in terms of pushing further that democratization.
Yeah. But I had a friend who tried to put a bunch of solar on their house, and they wanted to sort of do reverse and put it in the grid, and it was very complicated. So it was almost more of an idealistic experiment.
Right.
So
depends on when that was done.
Yeah.
I think it has been improving. I think there's been some regulation on that part. You see net metering, as we call it, the export to the grid. I think that is taking hold as a phenomenon. That's one part of the regulation that I think has worked well. But the point I want to raise was that not a lot of interaction has happened between people who've been doing it in the private sector and some of the UN agencies that have been involved in pushing that sustainable development agenda. What more do you think can be done on that front to enhance this interaction?
Well, perhaps we should get a little bit more involved with energy policy and a bit more advocacy on it, because the right economic incentives, the right economic instruments can make a huge difference, as in the case of putting solar into the grid. If you have the incentives that people are saving money, they'll make that investment. And we haven't been as involved, perhaps, as much as we should have, in that we've been focused on other areas. And partly that's because in the UN, you don't really have like a clear focal point. You don't have a United Nations Energy Agency. There's often been a discussion about it. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization has some expertise in some aspects, mainly alternative energy developments. UNDP does work on it. Of course, at the big level, the World Bank is, in a general sense, part of the UN family. But still, there's new coal plants being built in the country.
Indeed.
And I understand why they're being built, but it doesn't make sense in a framework beyond 5 years. Perhaps we should be advocating more, as much as we do on nutrition and things, we should be advocating on energy a bit more.
So, Neil, thanks a lot. I think there's lots more to talk about, but I think we've got positive time today. So thanks a lot for your time. I just want to finish off on one question. Are you optimistic on the future of sustainable development in Pakistan?
I think I am, in the sense that, as you said, there's more and more people who sort of see that it's in their benefit. It's not something that's abstract. It's not an international construct. And I see some political leadership that is willing to put in place some of the incentives for it. But I don't think, what I'm not quite so optimistic about is it happens fast enough to deal with the effects of climate change. I mean, I was just up in, as I mentioned, near Hunza. I think it's called Shisper or something. It's a glacier that's moving down very, very fast. And it's burst. And it's wiped out, actually, a small power generation facility. And if the local version of the NDMA, the Gilgit DMA, hadn't done something, it would have wiped out a bunch of villages. And those are the sort of things that are happening more and more. And I think government, private sector have to provide leadership so people do take those decisions on their own. Otherwise, they have so many other things to worry about that they'll tend to focus on the short term. And right now, Pakistan urgently needs long-term solutions to deal with the sort of avalanche of climate change that's waiting to happen.
So I think that's paints in very clear sort of terms the impact that we face going forward. I think we need policies, we need action that is climate ready, both on the private sector and the government. And I think the work done by UN and other development agencies is much appreciated. We need more of that. So Neil, I just want to thank you for taking time out to be with us today, to be part of this, what we believe is going to be an important forum going forward to bring stakeholders together from government, private sector, and development agencies, and for kicking off this dialogue. Thank you for all your contributions to Pakistan over the last 4 or 5 years across the various responsibilities you had. It's much appreciated, and we wish you the best of luck in your future endeavor in Bangkok.
Yeah, well, I'll be covering Pakistan too from there, so hopefully I can
fantastic.
do some work useful from there
Great.
for here.